I want to thank Pak Rektor, Pak Dean, and the Pak Rahmat Hidayat for this wonderful invitation to visit once again Universitas Gadjah Mada. This is a great university in a great country. This is a great university in a great country. Indonesia is a great country. And indeed, when I speak in the United States or in Western Europe now, I say that. Indonesia is a great country. It's always a great pleasure to return to Indonesia, and especially to the campus of Universitas Gadjah Mada, with which I've had an association since I was a graduate student working with Pak Masri Singarimbun here back in the late 1970s and teaching as a grad student in the Department of Anthropology. Then in 1999, I had during that year of so many changes, I had the great pleasure of teaching in Visipol here at UGM, and since then, since the late 1990s on up to today, I visit Indonesia and have collaborated with colleagues from Gadjah Mada University, especially from the CRCS, Center for Religious and Cultural Studies, every year. So it's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank you for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here because this is also a university and this is a city that has played a major role in the topic that I'll be talking about today, which is a topic which I will describe as the normative work. Pekerjaan normatif. Now, normatif dalam bahasa Indonesia mempunyai makna yang kadang-kadang agak membingungkan. By normative work, I mean ethical work. The efforts of Indonesian intellectuals, Indonesian religious leaders, Indonesian politicians to forge a vision of a common shared ethic, and an ethic which for many of those Indonesians, not least those who have been so central to that effort here at Gadjah Mada University, to forge an ethics that I think can be appropriately called a Nusantara ethics. A Nusantara ethics, a Nusantara normativity that I think has played a great role in making Indonesia a great country, and which has, needless to say, at times been the subject of great debate and controversy, because not everyone agrees with this particular Nusantara ethics. But that is what makes it all the more important for us today to speak about Nusantara ethics and a Pancasila ethics in a frank and supportive way. Now let me begin. I speak to you, of course, today against the backdrop of a widespread global crisis in democracy. A global crisis in democracies particularly found in plural societies, societies yang beragam, yang majemuk, like my own United States. And I would like to say that it's with sorrow that I say that the crisis of plural democracies is nowhere more clearly illustrated than in my own United States under the administration of President Donald Trump. I am not a person who affiliates with a party. I have worked for the United States government, both under Republican and Democratic administrations. I was personally close to Obama, President Obama, and his sister, Maya. But I've always made a point of maintaining independence. So I'd say what I say about the crisis of democracy globally and the crisis of democracy in the United States with a sad heart. This causes me great sadness to say that in my own United States, we see perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of the failure or the shortcomings of democracy to engage a plural citizenry, not least in the United States and West, a citizenry that now includes a significant number of Muslims. So in my remarks today, though, I'm not going to say more about the United States, if I said too much already about the United States. I'm going to focus on Indonesian democracy in the post-Suharto era, and I'm going to focus on democracy in the post-Suharto era from the perspective of, however, of a plural democracy, a perspective informed by struggles and conflicts taking place in the West, as well as in many other parts of the world. And it's a struggle and a conflict that I describe as the struggle for recognition, the struggle for pangakuan. It's sometimes, and I think it's appropriately called, citizenship. But as you'll hear me say today, citizenship is too kring. It's too general a term. And what we're dealing with here in Indonesia is a tradition of citizenship that, in as much as it is works and it is inclusive and it unites Indonesia because it does so on the basis of a recognition of all citizenships, all citizens as equal, notwithstanding their religious or ethnic background. That is one of the things that has made Indonesia and Indonesian democracy a negara yang betul-betul raya, a negara that is great. Now, what I'll suggest today is the middle way of Nusantara democracy has again to do with the way in which there's a pengakuan, a recognition of citizens from diverse backgrounds, but also a recognition, as the Pancasila emphasizes, a recognition of the fact that one doesn't have to live in a society where there's a high wall of separation between agama, religion, and politics. That there can be, if you will, that there is, as the Pancasila makes clear, and as Indonesian political history makes clear, there is a middle way, an option that rejects the high wall of separation of liberal secularism or secular liberalism, but also rejects, if you will, a too intimate, a too united collaboration between state officials and religious officials. And it's this middle way, I think, again, that makes Indonesia so remarkable. So Pancasila, a Nusantara ethics, a public ethics that is yang bernuansa Nusantara, is, I think, part of the keys, one of the keys to Indonesia's greatness. But it's an ethics, a public ethics, an ethics of universal recognition, pengakuan universal, that has at times also been under threat in Indonesia. Because as in all countries, the public ethics that inform Indonesia have been the focus, of course, of great debate and argument. So just to continue, the Indonesian example also reminds us of a general lesson, not just for Indonesia, although many of my remarks today will focus on the keistimewaan of Indonesia. But my point is general, is that for a democracy and citizenship to work in a way that is truly inclusive, democracy has to operate in such a way as to create a kind of public ethics. Democracy has to be public ethical making. Democracy has to be understood that it isn't just something that's formal and legal and juridical, but if it is to work in a way that avoids the extremes of populist simplification and or the extremes of the kind of binary that we've seen even in great countries like Malaysia, whereas Tamir Mustafa has said in a series of articles on politics in Malaysia, he points out that the great hope of a kind of symmetrical citizenship, an Indonesia-like citizenship, a Nusantara citizenship, has never been realized in Malaysia because certain opponents of a universal citizenship, a Nusantara, a kewargaan Nusantara versi Malaysia, this has been opposed by people who insist, no, this is contrary to a proper understanding of what Malaysia should be. So what's remarkable again about Indonesia is that Indonesian democracy since the Suharto era, yes, it's had trials, but it's also worked in such a way as democracy must. Democracy, if it is to reinforce a symmetrical and inclusive citizenship, a citizenship yang berlandasan atas etika Nusantara, democracy has to be not just formal and legal it has to be culture making. It has to reinforce that sense of a Nusantara ethics that looks at somebody from a different religious background, a different ethical background, a different ethnic background, and says, wah, ini bagian dari saya. Orang ini bagian dari saya. Walaupun dia beragama Islam, saya beragama Kristen, ini bagian dari saya. This, I think, is the brilliance of a Nusantara ethics, an ethics that's capable of uniting people from diverse backgrounds. So now let me begin and dig a little bit more deeply into these points. I begin first by underscoring the point that I began with today, from a more theoretical perspective, that democracy itself, the formal institutions of elections, a separation of powers, the things that we associate with modern democracy, these alone are not sufficient to create a public ethics of pengakuan universal, an inclusive recognition, an inclusive and symmetrical citizenship. In Western democracies, in recent years, we've seen that formal democracy is not alone to guarantee this universal and inclusive citizenship. In the United States, including, as I said, most dramatically, the United States, the confluence of new immigrants, be they Latin American or be they Muslim, the confluence of new immigrants, also, of course, Daesh, ISIS, terrorism, but especially a kind of growing Islamophobia that has swept large portions of the West, making me very sad. All these things, all these various things have reinforced a kind of alt-right, as we say in the United States, populism that has in turn undermined people's confidence in received understandings of the public ethics required to make democracy work. So there's a crisis of public ethics in the West, as there is in many non-Western countries as well. Now, what is arguably a crisis of social recognition and citizenship, remember I'm emphasizing both, not just formal recognition, formal citizenship, but recognition, an active engagement and recognition of another person as bagian dari saya, seorang Indonesia, or in the United States, a fellow citizen in a real sense, not just a formal juridical sense. What is arguably a crisis of social recognition and citizenship in Western liberal democracy has been paralleled in turn by an even greater sense of alarm in the Arab majority world. And it's with, of course, great sadness that I say this. By early 2013, the hopeful dreams of the 2011 Arab Spring had given way to the somber realization that in all but one Arab majority country, and that was Tunisia, progress toward pluralist democracy and an inclusive citizenship had more or less come to a halt, or worse, as in Syria. So people began to talk, and with good reason, about a crisis of citizenship in the Arab world. There's that I cite in the paper. But it's, of course, not just in Arab societies or the contemporary crisis of citizenship in the liberal West that we see these kinds of concerns rising. In places like, indeed in India, a society that has what is widely regarded as one of the best and most effectively functioning electoral democracies in the global South, in the non-Western world, we've seen the great hopes and pride and inclusiveness of Indian ideals of citizenship and recognition compromised in recent years by the rise of, if you will, a kind of Hindutva equivalent of what in the West are referred to as alt-right populisms, with a similar tendency to say, saya tidak mengaku kamu. Kamu dari belakang apa? Kamu orang Muslim. Hindutva itu berlandasan atas etika dan kultur mayoritas dan orang itu orang Hindu. So you see a similar kind of distortion and crisis of democracy even in a country with a recognizably proud and remarkable tradition of democracy like India. So the crisis is general, this crisis of recognition and citizenship is general. It's not just something that's peculiar to, Western Europe or a few societies. It is very, very being broadly experienced around the world, and with symptoms that are at least broadly similar, related to the rise of new varieties of extremist populism, which is an issue on which my colleague and friend here, Pak Vedi Hadis, has written much with great insight. This brings me to my second point. So my first point had to do with the crisis of democracy and recognition. My second point is, if we are to prevent democracy's uncivil culture and a kind of culture of non-recognition, what are we to do? What needs to be done? Now, to answer this question, we must first understand just how and why intolerance, exclusion, and non-recognition came to dominate public life and recognition even in settings like India or the United States, where procedurally the political system is seen as otherwise democratic. Now, if I can move to the Southeast Asian setting, in recent years here in Southeast Asia, scholars like Berenskat, Schult-Nordholt, and Bakker, in their recent 2017 book on citizenship in Southeast Asia, have said that the crisis of citizenship that they see taking place in large numbers of Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, according to them, has to do with a paradox. The paradox is that although many countries in this region, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, have systems of democratic elections and, as Berenskat et al. Say, a much livelier public sphere than they had several years ago, these achievements have, and now I quote them, Berenskat et al., they have done little to curtail the dominance of oligarchic elites and patronage politics. Berenskat et al., I'm hoping that perhaps a few of you are familiar with the work that I'm referring to, are certainly onto something. Oligarchy and patronage politics are indeed factors undercutting democratic politics in countries like Thailand, the Philippines, the United States, and yes, at times, Indonesia. But, and here I'm going to take exception with this book, I think this more or less structural analysis, if I may speak like a political scientist, I think this structural analysis is too simple because it ignores the normative and ethical influences, the culture-making processes that have also contributed to democracy's hesitation, both in countries like Thailand, Philippines, and perhaps the Indonesia, but also the United States. So as I said, to return to my second point, democracy is not just about elections, separations of power, and the rule of law. It is also and fundamentally about a certain kind of public normativity, a certain type of ethics. Here in Indonesia, a Nusantara ethics. The production and reproduction of that ethics is as critical to political life as are structural variables. The normativity of which I'm talking today in general, involves the traditions of law, ethics, and everyday sociability. Keramaan sosial. This was a concept that Cak Nur, Khalid Majid, put great emphasis on in the last years of his life. Keramaan kewargaan. So it's these kinds of ethics and normativities on which democracy depends. And these have to do with the ways in which, as Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, has put it, people recognize and coexist with one another in a given community or social world. All this is to say that the recognition about which I'm talking, and that's the core theoretical concept of my presentation today, can be understood as civic or citizenship-based. But we have to be very, very careful with this term, these terms, civic and especially citizenship. It's not sufficient. Both terms, the civic and citizenship, are sometimes understood in, again, a too legalistic, and as I think is the case with Berenskat et al., citizenship is understood often in a too state-centered way, as if it's a matter of a relationship of people with the state and just that. Certainly, the state must figure in any account of citizenship and social recognition, in a country, and it has here in Indonesia, as it has in my country. However, the citizenship norms that are critical, the public ethics that is critical for an inclusive and participatory citizenship are not limited to those people devise as, and here I'm quoting Berensgade et al. It's not limited to those that people devise as, quote unquote, strategies of coping with the modern state. I think this is much too simple, much too structural. Even less are they constituted by the norms that define citizens in liberal philosophical terms. And I know I'm speaking at a faculty of philosophy here, so I hope this reference will be familiar. Even less is recognition and citizenship constituted by the norms that define citizens in liberal philosophical fashion as a rights-bearing, autonomous individual, a kind of Kantian individual, free of the encumberments or embodiments, to borrow a term from the Harvard political ethicist Michael Sandel, a man who I quote quite often. Least of all, is it a citizen understood in this Kantian way as an individual autonomous of any kind of social connections, any kind of linkages to his or her fellows in society. This, I think, is a greatly oversimplified understanding of citizenship. And again, too formal, too juridical, and in this instance, if I may, maafkan atas, for those of you who are not philosophers, it's too Kantian. Kantian notions of citizenship are just not sufficient. Because the social recognition required for a genuinely inclusive citizenship has as much or even more to do with the values and practices people devise for recognizing and engaging ordinary people in their own societies. This is why Nusantara ethics and the Pancasila ethics is so important. To borrow a phrase from the political philosopher Axel Honneth, a German philosopher, that social recognition will be democracy and inclusivity enhancing only where it gives rise to, quote, a moral attitude that accords the other person an unconditional worth by which one's own behavior is to be checked. And that's what you hear with Nusantara ethics. I remember when I lived in East Java, and I'd go to meetings in Pasuruan, just in villages, and there would be somebody coming in to talk about Indonesia today. This was in the Suharto era. But it was so interesting to see that when someone was moved, when my villagers in Pasuruan were moved, a phrase that they often used to underscore their Indonesianness and their affection for somebody would be, wah, ini bagian dari saya. Orang itu bagian dari saya. That's the kind of recognition that we're talking about. That's the kind of Nusantara ethics that allows for a recognition that goes beyond the formal, legal, juridical ethics that's emphasized in purely more formal approaches to citizenship and recognition. This brings me to my third point. If normativity and ethics making, democracy has to be public ethics making. If normativity and ethics making are critical to the achievement of a citizenship premised on Honneth's notions of an inclusive and unconditional worth, a sense of true fellow feelingness. Itu bagian dari saya. Kamu adalah bagian dari saya. If this culture is to be achieved, whether in Indonesia or anywhere else, those values must not be neatly sequestered in just one social field. It's not enough that they just be political. They must shape interaction across a range of behaviors and interactions in society. What makes the study, and here I address the philosophers in the audience, what makes the study of normativity and coexistence in plural societies so complex, so challenging, and yet so deeply important is that in all societies there is a contentious varieties of ethical currents or registers, not all compatible with one or another. No society is just Nusantara or Indonesia. No society is just liberal in the West. No society is just Islamic or Christian. Every society is characterized by a kind of complex plurality of ethical registers And every society is to some degree profoundly shaped by the competition as well as the positive imbrication, synergy or interaction between registers from one field or another. And this has been one of the keys to Nusantara ethics. The fact that Nusantara ethics and Panchasila ethics are not an ethics just to stand in one social field. They're not just legal, juridico-political, but they're an ethics that has been, as a result of the normative work of many good Indonesians themselves, they're the result of a kind of fusion of religious ideals with political ideals, a kind of reinforcing of the ideals of an inclusive citizenship, an inclusive Panchasila citizenship with Islamic values for the Islamic community, Christian values for the Christian community, and values from a variety of ethnic and regional traditions around Indonesia. It's this imbrication. No society has just one set of values. Every society has a plurality of ethical registers flowing through it. But the trick of making democracy work and making citizenship more than just a kind of formal, empty slogan, but a living reality, is that values from religious and ethnic and cultural life merge with those of the political and the legal and give them a deeper meaning, a deeper sense of affection and identification, a deeper sense of mutual involvement. This, I think, is the real genius of a Nusantara ethics, an ethics that is made so as to reinforce rather than go against the values of democracy and participation, and most importantly, an inclusive practice of citizenship. In a society like Indonesia, powerfully reshaped by several decades of religious resurgence, I would argue, the making of an inclusive public ethics, a Nusantara ethics, has required many things, but two that I'll underscore here today. First, the making of such an inclusive ethics requires an ongoing and pervasive normative work by individuals and movements and organizations and institutions with the intellectual capacity and social legitimacy within a particular community to address the challenges of living together in difference in a way that those who identify with the ethical tradition in question, Islam, Christianity, Javanese culture, Minangkabau culture, they see the proposed citizenship and inclusivity as in accordance with, consonant with their deepest held religious values rather than artificial and or imposed. So normative work, people have to engage in normative work to reinforce this synthesis and synergy. Second, a culture of pluralist recognition and a culture of Nusantara ethics requires institutions and opinion leaders that, once the normative work is done, work to scale up and socialize the resulting public ethical culture, expanding its influence across the whole of society by creating collaborations for inclusivity and citizenship across the state-society divide, to use Peter Evans' terms, as well as within society. In so doing, they ensure that the civic culture and the formal terms of Panchasila citizenship, Nusantara ethics, are received and recognized as something real and intimate and personal, not something that merely has to do with one's relationship to the state. If my discussion so far sounds a bit abstract or vague, let me illustrate some of the dynamics that have made this Nusantara ethics possible and not merely an empty slogan. That's the key. What has made the transition to a Nusantara ethics and a democracy based on such an ethics here in Indonesia was that well before the transition of 1998 began, Indonesia already had in place many of the cultural resources required for the normative work and ethical scaling to make democracy and inclusive social recognition work in Indonesia, a Muslim majority society, of course. The first and most important cultural resource, we have to recognize this, for democracy and civility and that Nusantara citizenship had to do with Islam, Muslim Indonesians, and again, Pancasila civility, Nusantara ethics. In the years leading up to Suharto's ouster in May 1998, I think most of you know this, but it's important to state the obvious sometimes. In the years leading up to Suharto's ouster in May 1998 and the dawn of the Reformasi era, Indonesia witnessed the emergence of the largest pro-democracy movement the Muslim majority world has ever seen. Indonesia has the largest pro-democracy movement the Muslim world has ever seen. How is this possible? Normative work and public ethical scaling. Certainly, as Ed Aspinall and many others have emphasized, the movement, the pro-democracy movement here in Indonesia, was highly varied, and it included in its ranks people who had quite contradictory understandings of the kind of society and the form of citizenship they wanted to create. Remarkably, however, and I know many people have rejected this thesis, but I think it's important to hold to it. Remarkably, however, the central current in the Muslim, the Christian, the Hindu, the Buddhist wing of the democracy movement here in Indonesia displayed a feature that democratic theorists like Guillermo O'Donnell and Philip Schmitter have long identified as vital for a successful transition from authoritarian rule. What's that? A coalitional structure linking exemplary individuals, public intellectuals especially, to mass organizations in society capable of socializing the normative work of an inclusive citizenship forged by people like Nokolesh Majid, Shafi Marif, and others. As the great theorist of global democratization and a dear friend of mine who passed away last year, Alfred Stepan, observed in an essay in 2014, he said that what's remarkable about Indonesia, and he felt this strongly, he was not an Indonesianist, he was a scholar of democratic transitions, but Al Stepan said what's remarkable about Indonesia is that beginning in the 1990s, Indonesia had developed a core scholarship that provided Islamic rationales for democracy and Pancasila citizenship and Nusantara recognition to the wider Indonesian public. That's very, very important. Indonesia had in place a variety of public intellectuals who were regarded as legitimate leaders of their community, who put in place a kind of Islamic rationality in the Christian and Hindu and Buddhist community, a Hindu, Buddhist, or Christian rationale for a Nusantara ethics, for a Pancasila pluralism. As Al Stepan said, and if you don't know his work, you perhaps may not appreciate how remarkable and significant it is that he did say this. He said, Al Stepan said before he passed away, no country in the Muslim majority world has had such a decisive and far-reaching program of pro-democracy socialization by leading Muslim thinkers as Indonesia has. There's the normative work for an inclusive citizenship. There's the normative work for a Nusantara ethics. As it struggled toward and then returned to electoral democracy in 1998, 1999, of course, Indonesia also possessed a second comparative cultural advantage on matters of democracy, citizenship, and inclusive recognition. Sebuah pengakuan yang inklusif, yang mengaku orang dari semua latar belakang. The government, and what was remarkable here, what I'm referring to is the government-supported State Islamic University System, or UIN, EIN, as well as the private Muhammadiyah-owned network of universities, as well as, of course, public universities like Universitas Gadjah Mada. Indonesia had a wealth of higher educational institutions which already by the early to mid-1990s were creating, if you will, a new public ethical consensus on a Nusantara ethics that saw democracy and citizenship not merely as empty slogans, not merely as formalities, but things that if you will, had a basis in and resonated with the deepest of religious values of Indonesian citizens. This, too, was a comparative cultural advantage that Indonesia enjoyed. And I might add, as someone who's a dear friend of Egypt and has many friends in Turkey, this is a comparative cultural advantage that those two great countries, which again my friend Vedi Hadiz has studied, did not have on a comparable scale. Indonesia had in place and higher educational systems as well as public intellectuals who had already done the normative work of legitimating and accepting and making immediate and real the values of democracy and citizenship, so that these were not formal, empty, kering realities, but were realities that could be regarded as a Nusantara ethics, a Pancasila pluralism. There was also a third comparative advantage, which I'll be much briefer on, but I think it's worth mentioning. And it has to do with the situation of Muslim women here in Indonesia. We know in the early decades of the 20th century, Indonesia was among the first Muslim-majority nations. Perhaps you don't know this. I study Islamic education. Indonesia was among the first Muslim-majority nations to make general education widely available for Muslim women. It was ahead of Egypt. It was ahead of Turkey. It was well ahead, needless to say, of these countries like what would become Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Indonesia was one of the pioneers. Islamic education in Indonesia was one of the pioneers of women's education. And this has had remarkable fruits, both for the recognition of women as citizens. It's not perfect anywhere. But also for women's participation in a host of other activities. It's no coincidence that Muslim women here in Indonesia, to take a trivial economic fact, not a philosophical fact, it's no coincidence that Muslim women here in Indonesia participate in public labor, public employment outside of the home at a rate that is at least 2 and typically 3 times higher than their Muslim sister counterparts in countries like Jordan and Egypt. 3 times the rate. This too is part of a kind of reflection of the recognition that has been extended to Muslim women, and if you will, here in Indonesia, and the kind of foundation for, again, a more, in this instance, more gender inclusive understanding of citizenship. Needless to say, it's not perfect. It's not perfect anywhere. Together, these 3 achievements in the fields of democracy, recognition, higher education, and women's public life help to create what I think is a much stronger ethical consensus in which on democracy and citizenship, and it made possible a fourth and no less remarkable achievement in the course of the Reformasi transition. And this is the most difficult, because it has to do with elites. But it was the relative consensus among national leaders on the importance of implementing constitutional, democratic, and Pancasila reforms in the first years of the transition. A consensus which would subsequently be challenged and tested. But it was there in a very striking way in the early years of the transition. It was seen in such things as the extension of press freedoms, the legalization of political parties, the authorization of independent trade unions, as well as the referendum on independence in East Timor. In all these things, we saw evidence of, again, the kind of consensus among the political elite during the first years of Reformasi on what were the terms for a more inclusive and democratic practice of Indonesian citizenship. In mid-1999, as we all also know, the National Assembly passed 2 laws that launched one of the most remarkable and far-reaching programs of political decentralization the world has seen in modern times. Indonesian decentralization was one of the most extensive in the entire world, and it caused great challenges. It caused great problems. But nonetheless, it was remarkable and ambitious and a testimony to a kind of consensus that existed, at least in elite circles, in the early years of the democratic transition. We also know that between 1999 and 2002, Indonesian legislators crafted constitutional amendments designed to uphold religious freedoms in a manner that observers welcomed, perhaps a little bit too optimistically, as consistent with international standards of religious freedom. That would prove a little bit more contentious. Indonesia's, I'll be brief here because I'm going to have to skip the last part of my talk because I'm talking too slowly. So I want to bring it to conclusion. But Indonesia put a variety of reforms in place during the early years of Reformasi that testified to the fact that even though there were a variety of parties and there was unstinting contestation of the terms of democracy and citizenship, there was nonetheless great progress, and progress that testified to the continuing influence of what I would call very, very hesitantly a kind of Nusantara ethics, a Nusantara consensus, a Pancasila consensus. But this, of course, was challenged subsequently by later developments, and here's where I have to jump over the last 5 pages of my talk, so this will be very, very brief. The single greatest challenge to this consensus that we had in the early years of the 2 major challenges to this consensus in the early years of the Reformasi period were the following. The first had to do with the rise of a radical populism with a form, which Pak Vedi has again written very eloquently on, but a radical populism which I want to describe today had the characteristic of rejecting the idea that had been so central to the Nusantara consensus, rejected the idea that democratic and Islamic values, democratic and religious values, were not simply not opposed, but they could reinforce and strengthen each other. And this would be rejected by the rise of populist movements in certain areas of Indonesia in the early transition era, in part as a result of the unintended consequences of that overly ambitious decentralization program. This would be rejected by certain populists, radical populists who said, no, if you want to be a full citizen here, you have to come from a certain ethnic background. Or no, if you want to be a full citizen here, you have to have just one religion, not a Pancasila, any religion recognized by the state. So it was the rise of this it was an unintended consequence of this otherwise, I think, very, very ambitious and largely successful, if troubled, at times troubled, program of decentralization that we saw across Indonesia, but in particular in 8 of Indonesia's 34 provinces, the rise of radical populists who basically rejected a Pancasila pluralism. The second and final point that I'll make, the final development that went against the Nusantara ethics, the Pancasila pluralism that I have suggested was so conspicuous in the hopes and aspirations and policies of the early Reformasi period, has to do with a development more specific to the religious field. It has to do with the rise of a whole series of what I'll call, and I recognize this can be regarded as a bit sensitive, the rejection of this Pancasila ethics, of Nusantara ethics, had to do with the rise of a variety of transnational Islamist movements, all of which created a more plural and competitive Muslim organizational field than years earlier. I'm referring, of course, to groups like Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. What was most striking about these transnational groups is that whereas the Panchasila pluralist and the Nusantara ethics that they promoted had accepted the idea that Islam in Indonesia, or Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, but especially because this is a Muslim majority society, they had accepted and indeed promoted the idea that Islam in Indonesia has an ethical tradition that accepts and indeed benefits from the implementation of a democratic system of governance. Islam in Indonesia has an ethical tradition that reinforces and supports a more inclusive Nusantara ethics. This is what the early reformers, Cak Nur, Gus Dur, Shafi Marif, but many, many other great figures from the 1990s and early 2000s, this is, that they didn't always use these terms, this was the ethic that they had promoted. And it was this ethic that has been most consistently targeted as illegitimate and irreligious by at least some of the transnational activists who look at this legacy, this most remarkable legacy of Indonesian Islam and society, and they say, that is not properly Islamic. What you regard as Islam is not an authentic Islam. It's not my role. I'm not a Muslim. It's not my role to pass judgment on who's right or who's wrong. But what we have seen with the rise of these transnational movements has been the rise of, if you will, a kind of challenge, not merely to a particular profession of Islam, though that is deeply, deeply serious, but a challenge to what I think is the most remarkable of achievements here in Indonesia, which has been the creation of a Nusantara ethics and a tradition of Pancasila pluralism that says, no. Yang namanya demokrasi itu dan kewargaan itu bukan barang asing. Itu bukan ciptaan orang barat. Itu bukan suatu tradisi yang diciptakan kemudian diturunkan dari masyarakat Yunani kemarin dulu, kemudian diterapkan di Indonesia oleh orang yang dibarat-baratkan, pemikir yang westernized. No, the Nusantara ethics said Yunani has nothing to do with it. The Greeks had nothing to do with it. People like Cak Nur, Gus Dur, Shafi Marif, and many others said, no. Democracy is a modern instrument of governance. Its primary reality has nothing to do with the Greeks. Greek democracy was entirely different. The fact that it's called democracy is in some ways a kind of testimony to a genealogical error. A genealogical error, a misrecognition of how democracy comes into existence. So the promoters of a Nusantara ethics, the Muslims, thinkers, the Christians, the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Confucians, who came forward in Indonesia in the 1990s and said, no. Yang namanya demokrasi itu bagian dari tradisi kita. Yang namanya terutama kewargaan yang berlandasan atas Pancasila itu bukan ciptaan orang barat. Itu bukan semua imposition, tekanan dari luar, dari orang barat. Itu bagian dari dan ciptaan kita, masyarakat Indonesia sendiri. This was a most remarkable achievement. It's an achievement that I'm sorry to say, because I'm a great friend of many Egyptians, many Turks, and many of my dear friends in Tunisia, which is a great country and one that comes closest to having achieved something a little bit like Indonesia. But none of those countries have achieved the great synthesis of democracy and religious and indigenous values that Indonesia has. And it's for this reason, I end today, that I join with you in celebrating Pancasila pluralism and Nusantara ethics as something that is important and remarkable and above all Indonesian, but something that has given a blessing to the whole world. It's a blessing to the entire world, and it's something that for those of us in the West who are watching our own traditions of democracy and inclusive citizenship put in peril by radical populists. Those people, Muslims, Mexicans, or whatever, they're not citizens. For those of us who see our own traditions of inclusive citizenship put in peril by radical populists who, in the United States, have assumed the leadership of the country. For all of us, we look to Indonesia and we say, thank you. Thank you. And may God bless your efforts to strengthen, to consolidate, and to continue this tradition of Nusantara ethics, an ethics that is a blessing to Indonesia, and I would like to think a blessing to the entire world. So thank you very much.